They say the most dangerous man alive never raises his voice. They say he built an empire not with speeches or promises, but with the silence between his orders and the screams that followed. King Thorn Valerius, the Alpha who turned 8 centuries of fear into a throne no one dared touch. But what happens when the one thing he cannot conquer is a woman's whisper across a dying crystal? Stay with me until the very end of this one. Hit that like. And drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The storm had teeth, not the kind poets wrote about in their soft little verses, the kind that rattled windows and made children pull blankets over their heads. This storm ripped tiles off rooftops like fingernails torn from flesh. It bent iron lampposts sideways and turned rain into horizontal knives that cut visibility down to nothing. Inside Blackthorn Hall, the walls did not shake. They never shook. Lord Cassian Blackthorn had built his estate the way he built everything else, thick enough to muffle whatever happened inside from whatever pretended to care outside. 3 stories of black granite, windows narrow as arrow slits, a courtyard ringed with torches that guttered and spat but never went out, because servants replaced them every 40 minutes whether the wind demanded it or not. Alara Ashbourne knelt on the kitchen floor with blood drying on her knuckles and a cracked ceramic bowl at her feet. She was not crying. She had stopped crying 11 months ago, the night Duchess Seraphine had poured boiling broth across her forearms for serving at 2 degrees below the preferred temperature. That night, something behind Alara's eyes had changed. Not hardened. That would imply a choice. It had simply sealed over, the way skin closes around a wound too deep to stitch, leaving a ridge of scar tissue that feels nothing when you press it. She stared at the shattered bowl. The door behind her opened. "Get up." The voice belonged to Marin, the head housekeeper, a gaunt woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled so tight it stretched the skin at her temples. Marin had survived 14 years inside Blackthorn Hall, which meant she had learned to deliver cruelty the way a surgeon delivers a scalpel, clean, precise, and without hesitation. "I said get up, girl." Alara stood, her knees popped. She was 23, but her joints cracked like a woman twice her age. "Lord Cassian wants the east corridor polished before midnight." "I finished the east corridor 2 hours ago." "Then you finished it wrong. He found a smudge near the 3rd window." Alara looked at her, just looked. The kind of look that carried no defiance, because defiance required hope, and hope was a currency she had spent years ago. "A smudge," she repeated. "His words, not mine." "And if I polish it again, and he finds another smudge?" Marin's jaw tightened. Not from sympathy, from recognition. She had asked the same question once, years before, and the answer had taught her never to ask again. "Then you polish it again." Alara picked up a rag from the counter. Her forearms were latticed with pale scars, some old enough to blend into her olive skin, others still pink and raised like tiny mountain ranges mapped across her flesh. She did not hide them. There was no point. Everyone in this house knew where they came from. Everyone in this house pretended they did not. She walked toward the east corridor. The communication crystal sat in a hollowed stone behind the 3rd pantry shelf, wrapped in a strip of linen she had torn from her own sleeping mat. She had stolen it 6 weeks ago from a courier's saddlebag while unloading grain shipments at the service gate. A minor theft, the kind of crime that would earn her a beating if discovered. Maybe worse than a beating. Lord Cassian had once broken a stable boy's hand for taking an apple from the orchard without permission, and an apple was worth considerably less than a military-grade communication crystal. She had hidden it. She had held it every night. She had never used it. Because who would she call? Her parents were dead. Her sister had been sold to a labor camp in the northern provinces when Alara was 14. She had no allies, no patrons, no friends outside these walls. The crystal was not a tool of escape. It was a talisman, a small, cold object that reminded her hands what it felt like to hold something that was hers. Tonight, something was different. She could not name what had changed. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the smudge that did not exist on a corridor she had already polished twice. Maybe it was the way Duchess Seraphine had looked at her during dinner service, not with anger, but with amusement, the way a child looks at an insect before pulling off its wings. Alara stopped in the corridor. Her breathing was shallow. Her pulse climbed in her throat. She pulled the crystal from her apron. It was cold against her palm. She did not know the frequency she needed. She did not know if the crystal even worked. She closed her eyes and pressed her thumb into the activation groove, and she thought of the only face that had ever looked at her without demanding something in return. The crystal hummed. A faint blue glow leaked between her fingers. "Can you come get me?" Her voice cracked on the last word, not from volume, from the effort of saying something so small that contained everything she had left. The crystal went dark. She stood there in the silence of the east corridor with rain hammering the narrow windows and her own heartbeat filling the spaces between thunder, and she thought, "That was stupid. That was the stupidest thing you have ever done. He will not come." Why would he come? You are nothing. You are a smudge on a corridor that someone will polish away and never remember. She put the crystal back in her apron. She picked up the rag. She started polishing. 17 minutes later, the gates of Blackthorn Hall exploded from their foundations. The sound was not an explosion in the traditional sense. It was a compression, a single, massive impact that folded iron and stone inward like paper crushed in a fist. The shockwave traveled through the granite walls and knocked every hanging portrait in the east corridor sideways. Dust rained from the ceiling. The torches in the courtyard went out simultaneously, not from wind, but from the displacement of air itself. Alara dropped the rag. She pressed her back against the wall and felt the stone vibrate beneath her shoulder blades, like the bones of a living thing responding to a predator's footstep. Downstairs she heard shouting. Then she heard the shouting stop. In the grand foyer of Blackthorn Hall, Lord Cassian Blackthorn stood in his dressing robe with a goblet of wine frozen halfway to his lips. 12 house guards flanked him, armed men, trained fighters, professionals who had served the Blackthorn family for years and had never once questioned the violence they protected. The front doors were gone. Where they had stood, a man filled the frame. King Thorn Valerius did not look the way portraits depicted him. Painters gave him golden light and composed expressions, the serene authority of a ruler posing for history. In person, there was nothing serene about him. He was 6'4" and built like something forged rather than born. Rainwater ran down his face in rivulets that followed the hard lines of his jaw, his cheekbones, the scar that split his left eyebrow where an assassin's blade had missed his eye by a 1/4 inch 11 years ago. His eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of morning fog, the gray of wet iron, the gray of a blade that has just been drawn from its sheath and has not yet been cleaned. He was alone. No soldiers, no royal guard, no banner, no herald, no announcement. Just him. Lord Cassian found his voice. It took him 3 attempts. "Your Majesty, this is an unexpected... Where is she?" The words landed like stones dropped into still water. No inflection, no question mark. A statement disguised as a question, delivered by a man who had never in his life needed to ask anything twice. Cassian's fingers tightened on the goblet. Wine sloshed over the rim and stained his knuckles red. His guard shifted. Hands moved toward sword hilts. Training overrode logic, because logic would have told every man in that room to drop their weapons and kneel. "I am not sure I understand what your Majesty is—" "I will not repeat myself." Thorn stepped forward. 1 step. That was all it took. The nearest guard stumbled backward, boots scraping on marble, and the sound echoed through the foyer like a small private admission of cowardice. Cassian set the goblet down. His hand trembled. He was a cruel man, but he was not a stupid one. And the distance between cruelty and stupidity had never felt wider than it did right now with the most powerful alpha on the continent standing in his demolished doorway. If you are referring to one of the household staff, Alara Ashbourne. The name hung in the air. Cassian's expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, never guilt, but calculation. The rapid mental arithmetic of a man who was trying to determine how much trouble he was in and how much of it he could redirect. "The kitchen girl? Your Majesty, she is a contracted servant, bound by legal—" "I did not ask about her contract." "With all due respect, sire, the laws of domestic service are quite clear. She belongs to House Blackthorn under terms agreed upon by—" "She belongs to no one." Thorn's voice had not risen. It had dropped. And that was worse. When a man like Thorn Valerius raised his voice, it meant he was still willing to communicate. When he lowered it, communication was over. "Bring her to me, now." Cassian looked at his guards. 12 armed men. Trained, paid, loyal, or at least loyal enough to stand between their lord and whatever consequences he had earned. He calculated the odds. He considered the political implications. He thought about alliances, legal precedent, the cost of public humiliation against the cost of defiance. Then Duchess Seraphine appeared at the top of the staircase. She was 62 years old and looked 45, preserved by wealth and cruelty and a regimen of herbal treatments that cost more per month than most families earned in a year. Her silver hair was loose around her shoulders. Her nightgown was silk. Her expression was the one she reserved for situations she found distasteful. A faint thinning of the lips, a slight elevation of one eyebrow. The look of a woman who had spent her entire life arranging the world to her specifications and resented anything that disrupted the arrangement. "Your Majesty," she said, descending, each step precise, each word measured. "What an extraordinary entrance! I do hope you will allow us to repair the doors before the rain ruins the marble." Thorn looked at her. Seraphine stopped on the fourth step. She had spent decades managing powerful men, manipulating them, redirecting them, outlasting them with patience and venom. She had never been afraid of any of them. She was afraid now. She covered it well. Only her hands betrayed her, fingers curling around the banister with a pressure that turned her knuckles white. "The girl is upstairs," she said. "I will have her fetched. I will get her myself." "That is hardly appropriate. This is a private—" Thorn moved. Not fast. Not slow. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had crossed 100 battlefields and learned that haste was a luxury for people who doubted their own strength. He walked past the guards. He walked past Cassian. He walked past the goblet leaking wine onto polished marble, past the portraits of Blackthorn ancestors painted in oil and self-congratulation, past the doorways that led to rooms where unforgivable things had happened to people whose names no one bothered to remember. He climbed the stairs. Seraphine pressed herself against the banister as he passed. He did not look at her. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to reduce her, this woman who had built her life on the suffering of others, to a compressed silence that tasted like metal. He found Alara in the east corridor. She was standing with the rag still in her hand, pressed against the wall, her eyes wide, her breathing shallow, her entire body locked in the rigid posture of someone who had been conditioned to expect violence from every unexpected sound. Thorn stopped 6 feet away. He did not touch her. He did not move toward her. He stood in the dim corridor with dust settling around him like ash from a fire that had already consumed everything it was going to consume, and he waited. Alara stared at him. "You came," she whispered. "Yes. I did not think you would." "I know." Her chin trembled, not from tears, from the effort of holding together a body that had been running on silence and endurance for so long that kindness felt like a structural threat, the one thing her defenses had not been built to withstand. "You should not have," she said. "I am nothing. I am no one." "That is their lie, not yours." She looked at the rag in her hand, a filthy scrap of cloth that smelled of wood polish and resignation. She had been holding it so tightly that the fibers had left red impressions across her palm. She dropped it. Thorn extended his hand. Not a command, not a demand, an offer, the kind of gesture that carries weight only when it comes from someone who has never needed to make it before. Alara looked at his hand, looked at his eyes. Gray and steady and containing nothing except a single, unadorned fact. He was here. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and she felt the difference immediately. Not tenderness, not softness, but solidity. The grip of a man who held things and did not let them go. Her legs buckled, not from weakness, from the sudden disorienting absence of fear. Her body, deprived of the tension that had kept it upright for years, simply did not know how to stand without it. He caught her. He did not ask if she could walk. He did not tell her she was safe. He lifted her against his chest the way a man carries something he has been searching for. Not gently, not roughly, but completely. His arms locked around her and he turned toward the stairs. Cassian was waiting at the bottom. "Your Majesty." His voice had found a new register, harder, sharper, the voice of a man who had realized that humiliation was inevitable and decided to spend whatever dignity he had left on defiance. You are removing a contracted servant from my estate without legal authorization. The courts will file your claim. This is a violation of sovereign file. Your claim. Thorn descended the stairs with Alara against his chest. Her face was pressed into the side of his neck. He could feel her pulse against his collarbone, rapid, uneven, the heartbeat of a bird held in a hand that might crush it or release it. He walked past Cassian. He walked past the guards who had not drawn their swords and would tell their grandchildren that they had once stood in the same room as the Alpha King and that their survival was the bravest thing they ever did. He walked through the demolished doorway into the storm. Rain hit them both like a wall of cold water. Alara flinched against his chest. Her fingers dug into the fabric of his coat. She was shivering, not from cold, though the rain was cold, but from the primal, full-body tremor of an animal that has just been pulled from a trap and cannot yet believe the metal is no longer biting. His horse waited beyond the courtyard, a massive black warhorse that stood motionless in the downpour as if storms were beneath its concern. He mounted with Alara still in his arms, and the horse turned without command, reading the pressure of his thighs the way it had read 1,000 battlefield directives before. They rode into the dark. Behind them, Blackthorn Hall stood with its gates destroyed and its master standing in the rain-soaked foyer with wine stains on his fingers and the dawning realization that his world had just changed in ways his cruelty had never prepared him for. Duchess Seraphine descended the remaining stairs. "This is not over," she said. Cassian looked at his mother. His jaw worked. His hands opened and closed at his sides. "No," he said. "It is not." The royal compound at Vareth occupied the highest ground in the capital, a fortress built on bedrock that had not shifted in 1,000 years. The keep itself was austere. No gilded spires, no ornamental gardens, no concessions to beauty that might be mistaken for softness. Stone and steel and function. A building that looked the way Thorn ruled, without apology. He carried her through the main corridor, past guards who straightened but did not speak, past advisors who emerged from doorways and then retreated when they saw what he was carrying, past the war room where maps of 3 continents lay spread across tables lit by amber lanterns. He brought her to the private quarters. He set her down on a chair near the fire. She sat with her hands in her lap, fingers curled, back straight, the posture of a servant waiting for instructions. The habit was so deep it was structural. "You are not working," he said. "Sit however you want." She did not move. He crouched in front of her, his knees cracked. Battle scars ran across the backs of his hands like a map of every fight he had ever refused to lose. He looked at her forearms, the lattice of scars, some surgical in their precision, others ragged and improvised. "Who did this?" It was not a question. "It does not matter." "It matters." "Not anymore." She pulled her sleeves down. An automatic gesture, practiced, reflexive, the motion of a woman who had spent years making herself smaller so the world would have less surface area to hurt. "You came for me. That is more than I ever... That is enough." "It is not enough." His voice was low, not soft, low. The difference was important. Soft implied gentleness, low implied depth. The sound of something so heavy it could only be spoken from the bottom of the chest. "What they did to you, that is a debt." "I am alive." "Being alive is not the same as being whole." She looked at him, really looked, past the gray eyes and the scar and the jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as his fortress. She looked for the thing she had seen months ago at the royal gathering. The moment when the most powerful man in the known world had glanced across a crowded hall and noticed a woman no one else could see. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you notice me?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped, rain lashed the windows. Somewhere in the compound, a door closed and boots crossed stone floors, and the mundane machinery of empire continued its grinding, indifferent rotation. "Because you were the only person in that room who was not performing." "I was serving drinks." "Exactly. Everyone else was performing. Diplomats performing wisdom, generals performing strength, Nobles performing wealth. You were carrying a tray and your hands were shaking and you were looking at the floor and you were the most honest person in a room full of liars. Her eyes burned. She pressed her lips together until the skin around them went white. Honest is a kind word for broken, she said. It is not a kind word for anything. Honesty costs. Lying is free. You were paying the price of something most people in that room could not afford. The fire settled. A log shifted and sent sparks climbing toward the flue like tiny, desperate escapes. You need to rest, he said. He stood. His knees cracked again. He was 36 years old and his body carried the accumulated damage of 20 years of warfare like a ledger that would never balance. I will have food brought, and a healer. I do not need a healer. You do. The scars are old. I'm not talking about the scars. She understood. He was talking about the other damage, the kind that did not leave marks on skin, the kind that lived in the hollow behind the sternum where breathing felt like labor, and sleep felt like falling, and waking up each morning required a decision rather than a reflex. Rest, he said again. Tomorrow, we talk. She nodded. He walked to the door, stopped, turned. Alara. Yes. You asked if I would come. I did. Do not ask again. The answer will always be the same. He left. She sat in the firelight with her scarred forearms in her lap and the rain drumming against the windows of a fortress she did not belong in, and she breathed, just breathed. The kind of breathing that happens when the body finally understands that the next exhale will not be punished. It was the first time in years that her hands were not shaking. Morning came like a blade. The storm had broken overnight, leaving the capital glazed in pale sunlight that turned wet stone into mirrors. Thorn had not slept. He sat in the war room with a cold cup of something he had stopped drinking 3 hours ago, staring at a map of the Blackthorn Dominion, while his Lord Commander, General Roderick Hale, stood across the table with his arms crossed and his expression carved from professional concern. You pulled a contracted servant from a noble house without legal process, Hale said. I need you to understand what that means. I understand what it means. Do you? Because what it means is that Lord Cassian Blackthorn has grounds to file a formal grievance with the Imperial Council, which means a hearing, which means the council will subpoena the girl, which means she will be forced to testify in front of the same people who she will not testify. Then you will be in contempt of council authority. I am the council's authority. Hale exhaled through his nose. He was 51, weathered, built like a siege engine that had seen too many winters. He had served Thorn for 18 years and had earned the right to speak directly, which was a privilege he exercised with the frequency and caution of a man handling live ordnance. You are the king, which means you are also the law, which means when you break the law breaks. You understand the problem. Thorn looked at him. The problem is that a noble family tortured a woman for years and no one in my empire noticed. People noticed. Then the problem is worse than I thought. Hale uncrossed his arms. Crossed them again. A nervous habit he had never managed to train out of himself despite 2 decades of military discipline. What do you want me to do? Send an inspection team to Blackthorn Hall. Full audit. Every servant interviewed, every contract reviewed, every bruise documented. That will take weeks. Then it takes weeks. And in the meantime she stays here. In the royal compound. In the royal compound. Hale studied him. The general had seen Thorn make 1,000 decisions. Tactical, political, personal. He had seen him order retreats and advances, sign treaties and death warrants, choose between mercy and necessity, with the cold precision of a man who understood that leadership was the art of choosing which damage to accept. But this was different. There was something in Thorn's eyes that Hale had never seen before. It was not softness, it was gravity, the pull of something so dense it bent everything around it. You know what the court will say, Hale said quietly. I do not care what the court will say. You should. Because what the court will say is that the Alpha King has compromised himself over a servant girl, and that is the kind of story that your enemies will use. Let them use it. Thorn, let them. The name landed differently when Hale used it. Without the title, it was personal, an appeal from one man to another, stripped of rank and protocol and the comfortable distance that hierarchy provided. Thorne met his eyes. "I have spent 20 years building an empire that runs on fear," he said. "Every alliance I have made is built on the understanding that I am willing to destroy anything that threatens my position. Every treaty I have signed carries the implicit promise that breaking it will cost more than honoring it. I have been the most efficient machine this continent has ever produced. And I'm telling you right now, Roderick, if I cannot protect one woman who asked me for help, then none of it matters. Not the empire, not the treaties, not the fear, because a man who can conquer everything and protect nothing is not a king. He is a function." Hale said nothing. The silence was its own answer. "Send the inspection team," Thorne said, "and send Magistrate Voss. I want a legal framework for dissolving Blackthorn's service contracts by the end of the week." "All of them?" "Every single one." Hale nodded. He turned toward the door. Stopped. "The healer examined her this morning." "And?" "Malnourishment, chronic inflammation in both wrists from repetitive labor, scarring consistent with burns, lacerations, and blunt force trauma over a period of several years. Psychological evaluation pending, but the preliminary assessment is—" He paused. "Severe." Thorne's jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek pulsed once, twice. "Anything else?" Hale hesitated. The kind of hesitation that precedes information a man is not sure he should deliver. "There is something else. The healer, she found something in Alara's blood work." "What?" "An anomaly. She has never seen it before. She called it a resonance marker, some kind of genetic signature embedded in the blood cells themselves. She wants to run additional tests, but she mentioned a term I had to look up in the Royal Archives." Thorne waited. "Sovereign blood." The words dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. Thorne did not move. His expression did not change. But something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation, a reassessment, the rapid and silent restructuring of everything he thought he knew about the woman sleeping in his quarters. "Sovereign blood has not existed for 400 years, he said. "That is what I told the healer." "And?" "She showed me the results, 3 times. The resonance marker is unmistakable." "Who else knows?" "The healer, me, you." "Keep it that way." "For how long?" "Until I decide otherwise." Hale nodded and left. Thorne sat alone in the war room. The map of the Blackthorn Dominion stared up at him. Roads and rivers and territorial boundaries drawn by cartographers who believed the world could be contained in ink and parchment. He pressed his palms flat against the table and felt the grain of the wood beneath his calluses and thought about sovereign blood. The legends were older than the empire itself, a mythical bloodline that predated recorded history. Carriers whose genetic signature could amplify the power of any alpha who bonded with them. Not through magic, not through ritual, through something more fundamental, more biological, more terrifyingly real. A resonance between bloodlines that turned strength into dominance and dominance into something that empires had been built and destroyed to possess. If Alara carried sovereign blood, she was not a servant. She was a weapon. A weapon that every ruler, warlord, and shadow council on the continent would kill to possess. And he had just announced to the most dangerous noble family in Vareth that she was under his protection. 200 miles south, in a palace built from red marble and the bones of conquered nations, Emperor Lucicien Mordrake sat in a darkened chamber and listened to a spy's report. The spy was a thin man with forgettable features and the flat professional affect of someone who had made a career out of being invisible. He stood at attention before the emperor's desk and delivered his information in the clipped, efficient cadence of a military briefing. "The Alpha King removed a servant from Blackthorn Hall last night, personally, without legal authorization." Lucicien did not look up from the document he was signing. His pen moved in precise, unhurried strokes across the parchment. He was 48 years old, lean, sharp-featured, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes the color of old blood. He did not look like a warrior. He looked like a banker, the kind of man who would foreclose on your kingdom and apologize for the inconvenience while soldiers burned your capital behind him. "A servant," he repeated. Thorn Valerius rode through a storm to rescue a servant. Yes, Your Eminence. Name? Ilara Ashbourne, kitchen staff. No known family connections, no political value. Contracted to House Blackthorn for approximately 6 years. And yet the most powerful alpha on the continent personally demolished the gates of a noble estate to retrieve her. Yes, Your Eminence. Lucien set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. Behind him, a window overlooked the capital of the Crimson Dominion, a sprawl of red-roofed buildings and military towers that stretched to the horizon like a wound in the landscape. There is something we are not seeing. My sources confirm that Blackthorn's healers ran standard medical evaluations on their servants quarterly. The records show nothing unusual in Ashbourne's file. Blackthorn's healers are Blackthorn's employees. They report what Blackthorn pays them to report. The spy waited. Lucien steepled his fingers. His nails were clean, his cuticles were trimmed. Every detail of his appearance was managed with the precision of a man who understood that control was not just a strategy, but an aesthetic. Find out what Thorn knows that we do not, he said. Use whatever resources are necessary. And the girl? Lucien smiled. It was a thin expression, more architecture than emotion, constructed from the bones of 100 previous smiles that had preceded very bad outcomes for the people who witnessed them. The girl is irrelevant until she is not. When she becomes relevant, I want to be the first to know. The spy bowed and disappeared through a side door that blended so perfectly with the wall that it seemed to close into solid stone. Lucien sat alone in the darkened chamber. He picked up his pen. He resumed signing documents. And deep in the machinery of his mind, behind the clean nails and the measured voice and the smile that meant nothing good, gears began to turn. In the royal compound at Vareth, Ilara woke to sunlight and silence. She lay in a bed that was too large and too soft, and smelled of clean linen instead of wood polish and kitchen grease. For a disorienting moment, she did not know where she was. Her body tensed, the automatic full-system alert of a woman conditioned to expect the next blow before the last one had finished landing. Then she remembered. The crystal. The storm. The gates. Him. She sat up. Her arms ached. Her wrists throbbed with the deep structural pain of joints that had been overworked for years and were only now being given permission to feel it. She looked at her hands, chapped, scarred, the nails short and uneven from work that never ended and care that never came. A knock at the door. She flinched. The flinch was involuntary, a reflex encoded so deeply into her nervous system that she doubted it would ever fully disappear. "Come in," she said. The door opened. A woman in healer's robes entered, middle-aged, steady-eyed, carrying a tray with bandages and something that smelled sharp and medicinal. "I am Healer Corwin. I examined you last night while you were sleeping. I need to discuss what I found." Ilara's hands tightened in the blankets. "The scars." "Not the scars. Something else." Healer Corwin set the tray down and pulled a chair to the bedside. She sat with the careful posture of someone about to deliver information that would change the shape of someone's life. "Your blood carries a genetic marker that I have only read about in the oldest texts, a resonance signature that amplifies alpha dominance at a cellular level. The archives call it sovereign blood." Ilara stared at her. "I do not understand." "Your bloodline carries a trait that has not appeared in the recorded population for 4 centuries. It is extraordinarily rare, and it is extraordinarily dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "Because any alpha who bonds with a carrier of sovereign blood gains amplified power, strength, authority, dominance that extends beyond the physical into the political, the psychological, the territorial. You are not just a person with unusual genetics, Ilara. You are, functionally, the most strategically valuable individual on this continent." The words landed like stones in still water. Ilara looked at her hands, the same scarred, chapped, unremarkable hands that had polished corridors and scrubbed pots and carried trays for years in a house that treated her like furniture. "There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake. I ran the analysis 3 times. I am a kitchen servant. You are a kitchen servant who carries the genetic signature of an ancient bloodline that empires were built to possess. Those two things can be true at the same time. Elara's breathing changed, shallower, faster, the rhythm of a body that had just been given information too large to process and was defaulting to its most basic response: survive first, understand later. Who knows? The king, his lord commander, and now you. That is all? Healer Corwin hesitated. For now. Elara heard the weight in those two words. For now. A temporary state, a window that would close the moment the information left the walls of this compound. And when it closed, when the world learned what ran through her veins, the kitchen servant who had asked a king to come get her would become something she had never been before. A target. She looked toward the window. The pale morning light fell across the stone floor in clean, sharp lines, dividing the room into sections of brightness and shadow. Does the king know what this means? She asked. For him? I believe he does. And he still brought me here. He brought you here before the blood work was done. He did not know about the sovereign blood when he came for you. Elara closed her eyes. Something cracked inside her chest. Not pain, not grief. Something older and deeper. The fracture that happens when a person who has spent years believing they are worthless suddenly encounters evidence that their worth is so vast it could reshape the world. And in the distance, far beyond the fortress walls, beyond the capital, beyond the borders of Vareth itself, she could almost feel it. The tremor of something massive beginning to move. Armies, ambitions, empires, all of them turning toward her. The news traveled the way all dangerous information travels. Not through official channels, but through the cracks between them. A healer's assistant who lingered too long outside a doorway. A guard who mentioned the wrong name in a tavern. A courier whose loyalties split between two masters and chose the one who paid better. Within 72 hours, the phrase sovereign blood had moved from the private quarters of Vareth's royal compound into the whisper networks that connected every court, every war council, and every shadow broker on the continent. Thorn knew it would happen. Secrets inside empires did not leak. They hemorrhaged. The only question was how fast the bleeding would kill you. He stood in the Imperial Council chamber on the fourth morning after retrieving Elara, facing 11 men and women who collectively controlled more political power than most nations possessed. The chamber was circular, built from dark stone, lit by narrow windows that admitted light in thin surgical slices. The council members sat in a curved row behind a raised bench, an arrangement designed centuries ago to make whoever stood before them feel surrounded. Thorn did not feel surrounded. He felt impatient. Chancellor Aldrich Voss spoke first. He was 67, bald, precise, a man who had survived 4 changes of administration by making himself indispensable to whoever held power. His voice carried the flat, practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to deliver poison in measured doses. Your Majesty, Lord Blackthorn has filed a formal grievance. The charges include unlawful seizure of contracted labor, destruction of private property, and sovereign overreach. I am aware. The Council is obligated to respond. If we ignore a formal grievance from a recognized noble house, we establish a precedent that... Aldrich. Yes, Your Majesty? Have you read the inspection report? Voss paused. The kind of pause that said yes, he had read it, and no, he did not want to discuss it in front of 11 witnesses. I have reviewed the preliminary findings. Then you know that Blackthorn Hall contained 14 servants with documented injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. You know that 3 of those servants were minors. You know that the medical records kept by Blackthorn's own healers were falsified to conceal the extent of the damage. You know all of this. The inspection is ongoing. The findings have not been formally... Say the word. Voss blinked. Your Majesty? The word you are avoiding. Say it. Silence. The kind that fills a room when everyone present knows the answer, but no one wants to be the first voice attached to it. Thorn said it for them. Torture. The word is torture. A noble house under my sovereignty operated a torture operation disguised as domestic service, and the system designed to prevent it, your system, this council, failed to detect it for 6 years. That is not a legal technicality. That is an institutional collapse. Councilwoman Margaret Steele leaned forward. She was 53, sharp-jawed, former military intelligence, and the only member of the council Thorne genuinely respected. She did not soften her questions, and she did not waste his time. "No one in this room is defending Blackthorn," she said, "but the grievance is a mechanism. Cassian is using legal process to force a public hearing. If you refuse to participate, you give every noble house in the Empire permission to accuse you of autocratic overreach." "I am an autocrat. That is the job description." The job description is sovereign authority exercised within institutional constraints. The moment you operate outside those constraints, your authority becomes personal rather than structural, and personal authority dies with the person. Thorne looked at her, not with anger, with the focused attention of a man who recognizes a valid argument and resents it for being valid. "What do you recommend?" "Accept the hearing, attend it, present the inspection evidence. Let the council strip Blackthorn of his titles through proper channels. The outcome will be the same, but the process will protect the institution." "And Alara?" "She testifies." "No. Thorne, she does not testify. She does not sit in front of this council or any other body and describe what was done to her so that men in expensive robes can take notes and feel useful. That is not justice. That is performance. It is procedure." "Then procedure is wrong." The chamber went quiet. 11 council members sat behind their raised bench and felt the specific, uncomfortable gravity of a ruler who had stopped negotiating. General Hale, standing near the door in his capacity as military observer, watched Thorne's hands. They were flat on the table, steady, but the tendons stood out like cables under tension. Voss cleared his throat. "There is another matter. The Intelligence Directorate has intercepted communications suggesting that Emperor Mordrake has dispatched agents to Vareth. Their purpose is not yet confirmed, but the timing is not a coincidence." "No, Your Majesty, it is not." Thorne straightened. The room felt his shift in posture the way a field of grass feels a change in wind. "Lucian knows. We cannot confirm. He knows, or he suspects enough to move on suspicion, which amounts to the same thing." Thorne turned toward Hale. "Double the security detail on the private quarters. No one enters without my direct authorization. No staff changes. No new assignments. No rotations." "Already done." "Triple the perimeter watch." "Done this morning." Thorne nodded. The acknowledgement carried weight. Not gratitude, which would have implied surprise, but recognition, which implied trust. "This council will reconvene in 3 days," he said. "By then, I expect a complete legal framework for dissolving every service contract in the Blackthorn Dominion and a formal indictment of Lord Cassian Blackthorn for crimes against imperial subjects. If the framework is not ready, I will dissolve the contracts by royal decree, and this council can file its own grievance." He left. The council members sat in the aftermath of his departure the way civilians sit after an earthquake, still, disoriented, recalibrating. Councilwoman Steele broke the silence. "He is going to war over this woman." "He is going to war over a principle," Voss corrected. "No. I have seen him fight for principles. This is different. This is personal. Which makes it more dangerous. Which makes it inevitable." Alara was standing by the window when Thorne entered the private quarters. She had found clothes somewhere. Simple linen, too large for her frame, rolled at the sleeves and belted at the waist with a strip of fabric that looked like it had been torn from a bedsheet. Her hair was damp. She had bathed. The act of bathing without fear, without listening for footsteps, without calculating how quickly she could dress if someone entered, had taken her 40 minutes and left her shaking. She turned when the door opened. The flinch was still there. Smaller now, but present. A flicker in her shoulders. A half-second compression of her spine. The echo of a body trained to expect impact. "The council?" she asked. "Handled." "That is not an answer." He stopped, looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but attention. The recognition that the woman standing in front of him was not the same woman he had carried out of Blackthorn Hall 4 nights ago. She was still damaged, still wary. But the silence she carried had changed texture. It was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of someone listening for information she intended to use. "Blackthorn filed a grievance," he said. "The council wants a hearing, I told them the hearing will happen on my terms, and if it does not, then I dissolve the council's authority over the matter and handle it myself. You cannot dissolve the council's authority every time they disagree with you. I can. I choose not to. There is a difference. She studied him. Her eyes were dark, not the poetic darkness of romance literature, but the functional darkness of deep water, the kind that concealed depth and current and things that moved beneath the surface. The healer told me about the sovereign blood. I know. You knew before she told me. I knew 12 hours before you woke up, and you did not tell me yourself. You needed sleep more than you needed information. That was not your decision to make. The words landed clean and hard, like a blade laid flat on a table. Not aggressive, not defiant, just precise. The statement of a woman who had spent years having decisions made for her and was finished accepting the arrangement. Thorn held her gaze. Most people could not hold his gaze for more than a few seconds. The weight behind his eyes was not metaphorical. It was the accumulated pressure of a man who had carried an empire on his shoulders for 2 decades and had never once looked away from what that weight demanded. People flinched. People deferred. People found reasons to look at the floor, the wall, anywhere except directly into the gray certainty that lived behind his pupils. Alara did not look away. You are right, he said. It was not my decision. Then tell me now. All of it. He told her. He told her about sovereign blood, what the archives said, what the legends claimed, what the genetic marker meant in practical terms. He did not soften it. He did not frame it as an opportunity or a gift or a destiny. He laid it out the way he laid out battlefield intelligence. Facts first, implications second, options last. Every alpha on this continent will want you, he said, not as a person, as an asset. Bonding with a carrier of sovereign blood amplifies dominance to a degree that has not been documented in 4 centuries. Whoever controls that bond controls the most powerful military advantage in the known world. And you? What about me? You are an alpha, the most powerful one alive. You brought me here. You are protecting me. The entire world will assume you intend to claim the bond for yourself. The entire world can assume whatever it wants. That is not what I asked. He was quiet. Not the tactical silence of a man choosing his words. The real silence of a man confronting something he had not yet resolved within himself. I brought you here because you asked me to come, he said. Not because of your blood. I did not know about your blood. I came because you were alone, and you were hurting, and you called the only person you had left to call. That is the reason, the only reason. And now? Now I am going to protect you because you need protection, and I am going to dismantle the house that hurt you because it deserves to be dismantled. And I am going to deal with whatever comes through my gates, Lucien, the council, the entire continent if necessary, because that is what I do. Because you are the king. Because I gave you my hand and you took it, and I do not let go. The fire crackled. Outside the window, the capital sprawled beneath a sky that was turning the color of bruised steel, clouds massing on the western horizon like an army assembling for a second assault. Lucien will come, she said. Yes, not just agents, not just spies. He will bring everything. I know. And you will fight him. If he makes me. He will make you. Men like Lucien do not negotiate for things they can take. Thorn looked at her with something that might have been surprise if surprise were an emotion his face still knew how to produce. She had just described Lucien Mordrake with more accuracy in 2 sentences than his intelligence directorate had managed in 2 decades of analysis. You understand power, he said. I was owned by it for 6 years. Understanding was a survival requirement. That is not the same. It is exactly the same. The servant who reads the master's mood before the master feels it is not less intelligent than the general who reads the enemy's strategy. She is more intelligent because the general's mistake costs him a battle. The servant's mistake costs her a beating. The words sat between them like a weapon neither had drawn. Thorn felt something shift inside his chest. Not affection. Affection was too small a word. Not desire, though desire was there, banked beneath layers of discipline like coals buried under ash. What he felt was recognition, The same recognition he had felt at the royal gathering months ago, the awareness that the woman in front of him was not broken. She was compressed. Pressure had not destroyed her. Pressure had made her denser, harder, more concentrated. She was a diamond that had been mistaken for gravel, and the mistake had been everyone else's, not hers. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need the real answer, not the polite one." "I do not do polite. Do you want to stay?" She blinked. The question surprised her. He could see it in the way her breathing changed. A slight catch, a half-second delay, the physiological response of a woman who had not been asked what she wanted in so long that the question itself felt foreign. "You are offering me a choice." "I am. No one has offered me a choice in 6 years, which is why I am asking." She turned back to the window. The storm clouds had thickened. The light in the room was changing, dimmer, heavier, the kind of light that made shadows grow teeth. "If I leave, where would I go?" "Anywhere. I will provide resources, protection, transportation. You can disappear, start over, build a life that has nothing to do with empires or blood or men who think they have the right to own what they cannot understand. And the sovereign blood goes with you. It is yours, not mine, not the council's, not Lucian's. If I leave, you lose the advantage." "I never had the advantage. I have a responsibility. Those are different things." She pressed her forehead against the glass. It was cold. The sensation grounded her, a small, physical anchor in a conversation that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff and being told she could choose whether to jump or step back, and that either choice would change the world. "I spent 6 years in a house that treated me like property," she said. "I scrubbed their floors and served their meals and absorbed their cruelty and survived it because surviving was the only verb I had left. And every night I lay on a mat in a room with no windows, and I told myself that the world outside those walls was the same, that every hand extended was a leash, that every kindness was a transaction, that the only person who would never betray me was the person who expected nothing." She turned. "You are the first person who has expected nothing." "That is not entirely true." "What do you expect?" "An answer." She almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles were not sure they remembered how, but the architecture of the expression was there. A slight lift at one corner of her mouth, a flicker of something warm behind the dark eyes. "I will stay. Because you asked instead of told, and in my experience, the man who asks is the one worth answering." Thorne exhaled. It was a small sound, the kind of exhale that carries more weight than a speech. The release of tension held so tightly and for so long that the holder had forgotten it was there. Then the door opened without a knock. Hale stood in the doorway. His face was pale, not the pale of fear. Hale did not do fear, but the pale of a man who has just received information that changes the shape of every plan currently in motion. "We have a problem. Speak." "Lucien has sent a formal diplomatic envoy, 12 riders under the Crimson Banner. They crossed the northern border 2 hours ago." "An envoy is not a problem. It is a negotiation." "The envoy is carrying a sealed demand. Our intercepts decrypted it 30 minutes ago." "What does it say?" Hale looked at Alara, then back at Thorne. "He is demanding the surrender of the sovereign blood carrier. Full custody. Immediate transfer to the Crimson Dominion." The room compressed. The air thickened. "And if I refuse?" "The demand includes a war declaration clause. If the carrier is not surrendered within 14 days, the Crimson Dominion will consider Vareth in a state of open hostility." He is bluffing. He has mobilized 3 army groups along the eastern border, 60,000 troops, supply lines established, forward camps operational. Thorne stood very still. His hands hung at his sides. His breathing did not change, but his eyes, those gray, iron-cold eyes, shifted in a way that Hale had only seen twice before in 18 years of service. Both times had preceded wars that redrew continental maps. Alara watched him. She watched the stillness that was not calm but contained force, the immobility of a man calculating the exact amount of violence required to solve an equation that diplomacy had just failed. 14 days, she said quietly. Thorn looked at her. He wants me, she said. Surrender me, and the war does not happen. You are not being surrendered. 60,000 soldiers, Thorn. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. He felt it land. 60,000 soldiers, he repeated, against the empire that broke 100,000 at the siege of Ashenmoor, against the army that has not lost a campaign in 20 years, against me. He turned to Hale. Recall every field division within 72 hours of the capital. Activate the reserve legions. Send word to the border fortresses. Full defensive posture, no engagement until my order. That is a war footing. That is what it is. Hale nodded and was gone. Thorn walked to the window and stood beside Alara. Their reflections overlapped in the glass, his broad and rigid, hers narrow and still, two shapes pressed together by proximity and separated by everything that had happened before this moment and everything that was about to happen after it. You could still leave, he said. No, she said. I could not. Outside, the storm broke. Lightning split the western sky in a jagged white line that turned the entire capital into a photograph of itself, frozen, sharp-edged, and illuminated in the kind of light that makes everything look like it is already a memory. 12 riders under the crimson banner were crossing the northern border. 60,000 soldiers were waiting behind them. And in a fortress built on bedrock that had not shifted in 1,000 years, a king and a kitchen servant stood side by side at a window and watched the sky crack open. The world was about to learn what it cost to take something from Thorn Valerius. The answer was everything. The Crimson Envoy arrived at the gates of Vareth on the 6th day. 12 riders in polished armor the color of dried blood, each carrying a banner that snapped in the wind like a tongue tasting the air before a strike. They did not dismount. They did not request entry. They sat their horses in a perfect line outside the main gate and waited with the professional patience of men who understood that waiting was itself a form of aggression. Thorn watched them from the war room window 300 feet above. Hale stood beside him. Neither man spoke for a long time. Below, the capital continued its morning routine. Merchants opening stalls, soldiers changing guard shifts, smoke rising from bakeries and forges in thin columns that bent eastward in the wind. The city did not know yet. The city carried on, the way cities always carry on, grinding through the small machinery of daily survival, while the people who controlled its fate stood in high rooms and calculated the weight of decisions that would crush thousands. 12 riders, Hale said finally. Full diplomatic protocol. Lucien is being polite. Lucien is being strategic. Polite as the mask he puts on the knife before he slides it between your ribs. Do we receive them? Thorn's jaw worked. The muscle in his cheek pulsed, that involuntary rhythm that Hale had learned to read the way sailors' rid shifts in the wind. We receive them. In the vault of crowns, full court, every council member present. You want witnesses. I want a record. When this goes sideways, and it will go sideways, I want every person in that room to remember exactly what was demanded and exactly what was refused. Hale nodded and left to make arrangements. Thorn stayed at the window. He pressed his knuckles against the stone ledge until the pressure turned his skin white. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. A face that looked older than 36, carved by years of decisions that left marks deeper than any blade. He thought about Alara sleeping 2 floors below. He thought about 60,000 soldiers massed along his eastern border. He thought about the specific geometric cruelty of a world that had handed him the one person he refused to lose and simultaneously handed his enemies the exact same person as a reason to destroy him. He did not think about choices. He had already made his choice. What occupied him now was cost. The Vault of Crowns was the oldest chamber in the royal compound, a vaulted hall of black stone and iron where every coronation, every declaration of war, and every sovereign death in 8 centuries had been witnessed by the same walls. The ceiling arched 40 feet overhead, supported by pillars carved with the names of dead kings in a script so old that half the letters had been worn smooth by time. Torchlight filled the space in amber pools that left the corners in darkness, as if the room itself understood that some things were better left in shadow. The court assembled. 11 council members in their formal robes, 32 ranking officers in dress armor, magistrates, advisors, secretaries, scribes. The full bureaucratic weight of an empire arranged in concentric rows around a central dais where the throne sat like a fist of black iron. Thorn did not sit on the throne. He stood in front of it. The distinction was deliberate. Sitting implied reception. Standing implied readiness. The Crimson Envoy entered. Their leader was a man named Draven Kael, Lucien's chief diplomat, a title that was itself a polished lie, because Draven Kael had never in his career resolved a conflict through dialogue. He resolved conflicts through the careful arrangement of circumstances that made war appear to be the other party's fault. He was tall, angular, with the lean build of a predator designed for endurance rather than power. His hair was iron gray. His eyes were the pale blue of ice that has not yet cracked, but will. He walked the length of the vault with 11 riders behind him, their boots striking the stone floor in a synchronized cadence that turned their approach into a kind of martial music. He stopped 10 feet from the dais. King Valerius, Ambassador Kael, I carry a formal communication from Emperor Lucien Mordrake, sovereign of the Crimson Dominion, protector of the Eastern Reaches, and commander of the Allied. I know his titles. Read the demand. Kael's expression did not change, but something flickered behind those pale eyes. A recalculation, a minor adjustment to a strategy that had assumed the usual diplomatic theater of posturing and preamble. He unrolled a scroll. The parchment was crimson. The seal was black wax pressed with the Mordrake crest, a serpent consuming its own tail, which Thorn had always considered the most accidentally honest heraldry on the continent. By order of Emperor Lucien Mordrake, the Crimson Dominion formally requests the immediate surrender of the individual known as Elara Ashbourne, identified as a carrier of the sovereign blood genetic marker. The Dominion asserts sovereign interest in the preservation and study of this bloodline under the terms of the Continental Heritage Accord, Article 7, which grants any recognized sovereign state the right to petition for custody of individuals possessing traits deemed critical to regional stability. The words settled over the court like sediment sinking through water. Thorn did not move. Is that all? There is a secondary clause. In the event of non-compliance within 14 days of formal delivery, the Crimson Dominion will consider the Kingdom of Vareth to be in a state of active hostility, with all attendant military consequences. So it is a threat wrapped in legal language. It is a lawful petition under established international precedent. It is a man demanding I hand over a human being as if she were cargo. The language does not change the content. Kael rolled the scroll. His fingers were steady. His breathing was even. He had delivered worse demands to worse men and had walked out alive every time. But there was something in the air of this room, a density, a compression, that made the back of his neck tighten in a way his training could not override. Emperor Mordrake wishes me to convey that he holds King Valerius in the highest regard. This is not an act of aggression. It is an invitation to cooperation. Tell Lucien that his invitation is refused. Tell him that Elara Ashbourne is a free citizen of Vareth under my personal protection. Tell him that any attempt to remove her from my territory will be treated as an act of war. And tell him that if he wants to test the difference between his army and mine, I am willing to provide a lesson he will not survive. The court held its breath. Kael inclined his head. The gesture was perfectly calibrated, respectful enough to maintain protocol, shallow enough to communicate that respect was a formality and not a sentiment. I will convey your response, Your Majesty. Emperor Mordrake will be disappointed. Emperor Mordrake will survive his disappointment. Others may not. Kael turned. His riders turned with him. 12 sets of boots struck stone in synchronized retreat. The doors of the vault opened and closed. The sound of hoofbeats rose from the courtyard and faded into distance. The court exhaled. Thorn stood before the empty vault and felt the weight of what he had just committed to settle across his shoulders like iron. Councilwoman Steele approached the dais. Her face was carefully composed, but her eyes carried the specific intensity of a woman who had just watched a match struck in a room full of powder. 14 days, she said. 13 now. You just declared war. Lucien declared war. I accepted. The distinction will not matter to the soldiers who die. Thorn looked at her. It will matter to the woman who lives. He left the vault. The betrayal came on the 9th day. Thorne was in the war room at 3 in the morning, bent over deployment maps with Hale and 3 division commanders, when the door burst open and a junior officer entered at a dead run. The man's face was the color of ash. His uniform was disheveled. He had clearly been pulled from sleep and had not taken the time to dress properly because the information he carried did not allow for grooming. "Your Majesty, the eastern perimeter. There has been a breach." Thorne straightened. "Specify." 3 sections of the outer defensive grid have been deactivated, Towers 7, 9, and 12. The sentries, our sentries, opened the access gates from inside. The room went cold. Not a temperature change, a psychological one. The specific suffocating cold that descends when a man realizes that the threat he had been preparing to meet at his borders was already inside his walls. Hale moved first. "Which sentries?" "Names. Sergeant Aldrich Vane, Corporal Misha Torrin, Private First Class Dominic Fell." "Those are my men," Hale said. His voice was flat, controlled. But beneath the control, something was fracturing. The structural integrity of a man who had built his career on the reliability of the soldiers under his command, and was watching that reliability dissolve in real time. "They have served under me for years. Vane has been with me since the Ashenmoor campaign." "They were bought," Thorne said. "We do not know. They were bought. Lucian does not force loyalty. He purchases it. He finds the price. Money, family, blackmail, ambition, and he pays it. The breach is not military. It is financial. If the eastern grid is down, the compound is exposed from 3 approach vectors. I know. If Lucian has agents already inside the capital, I know. Thorne's hands were on the table, both palms flat, both knuckles white. He stared at the map and felt something reorganize itself inside his chest. Not panic, not fear, but a violent, molecular-level recalibration of trust. Every face he had relied on, every chain of command he had believed was solid, every assumption he had made about the loyalty of men he had led into battle and brought home alive, all of it was now contaminated by the possibility that any one of them had a price. This was what betrayal did. It did not just break the specific bond that had been violated, it irradiated every bond adjacent to it. One traitor made every loyal man suspect. One crack made every wall questionable. The damage was not surgical, it was systemic. "Where is Alara?" he said. "Private quarters. 2 guards at the door." "Which guards?" Hale opened his mouth, closed it. The question he had just been asked, which guards, carried a weight that neither man wanted to fully acknowledge. Because the answer might not matter. Because any name Hale gave could be the next name on a list of men who had been bought. "I will go myself," Hale said. "No. I go." Thorne moved through the compound like a man walking through a building that had just been condemned. Every corridor a potential failure, every shadow a concealment, every closed door a question he could not answer until he opened it. His hand rested on the hilt of the blade at his hip. He had not drawn a weapon inside his own compound in 18 years. The fact that his fingers now curled around the grip told him everything he needed to know about how fundamentally the ground beneath him had shifted. He reached the private quarters. 2 guards flanked the door. Young men, professional postures, steady eyes. He looked at them and could not determine whether they were loyal. That inability, that poisoned uncertainty, was worse than the breach itself. "Open the door." They opened it. Alara was awake. She was sitting in the chair by the dead fire, wrapped in a blanket, with a knife in her hand. A kitchen knife she had taken from the tray of food delivered earlier. She held it the way someone holds a tool they know is inadequate but refuse to be without. Blade down, grip tight, wrist braced. She saw Thorne and did not lower the knife. She saw the expression on his face and her breathing changed. What happened? "Breach. Eastern perimeter. 3 of my soldiers opened the gates from inside." She processed this in silence, her jaw set, her eyes narrowed. The computational speed with which she assessed the implications was something Thorne filed away, not with surprise but with confirmation. This was a woman who had survived 6 years in a house of predators. Threat assessment was not a skill she had learned. It was a language she spoke fluently. Lucien's people. Yes. How deep? We do not know yet. That is the problem. The problem is not how deep. The problem is that you cannot trust the people who are supposed to tell you how deep. She was right. She was exactly right. And the precision of her analysis hit him in a place that was already raw. You need to move, he said. Where? The inner keep. Stone walls, single access point, no external windows. I can control who enters. You can control the door. You cannot control the people behind it. Elara, I am not arguing. I am telling you what you already know. This is not a military problem. This is a trust problem. And you cannot solve a trust problem with thicker walls. She stood. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She was thin, the kind of thin that comes not from constitution but from years of insufficient food, the body cannibalizing its own reserves because the environment refused to provide. But she stood straight. The knife was still in her hand. What do we do? She asked. He noticed the pronoun. We, not you, not the king and his generals. We. Two people standing in a room that might already be compromised, holding a conversation that might already be overheard, making plans that might already be irrelevant. We find out who else has been bought. We do it fast. And we do it quietly. And the envoy, the 14 days. 9 days left. Lucien does not need 14 days if he already has people inside your walls. The deadline is not a countdown. It is a distraction. Thorn went still. The realization moved through him like a wave of nausea, the sudden, visceral understanding that he had been thinking about this wrong. He had been preparing for a war that would arrive at his borders. Lucien was not sending a war. Lucien was building one inside his house. Every strategy Thorn had constructed over the past 9 days, the troop deployments, the defensive positions, the border fortifications, was oriented outward, facing the wrong direction. While he had been watching the horizon, the enemy had been sitting at his table. He thought about the inspection team at Blackthorn Hall, the council hearing, the legal framework he had demanded. Every institutional process he had set in motion over the past 2 weeks had consumed attention, resources, and time, all directed at a noble house that was, he now realized, a diversion. Cassian Blackthorn's grievance had not been an act of wounded pride. It had been a manufactured distraction, a legal tripwire designed to keep Thorn's focus sucked on internal procedure while Lucien's agents infiltrated the compound. The sophistication of it was breathtaking, and the fact that Thorn had not seen it until a kitchen servant pointed it out was a kind of wound that would leave a scar no healer could treat. Cassian, he said. The name tasted like ash. What about him? He was never filing a grievance. He was buying time for Lucian. Elara's eyes changed, not widened, hardened. The pupils contracted and the muscles around them tightened, and the dark irises became surfaces that reflected light without absorbing it. Blackthorn is allied with the Crimson Dominion. Blackthorn is owned by the Crimson Dominion. The grievance, the legal process, the council hearing, all of it was theater, designed to keep me looking at the wrong stage while the real performance happened behind the curtain. The compound alarm sounded. The sound was a deep percussive tone that resonated through the stone walls like a heartbeat amplified to architectural scale. It meant a perimeter breach in progress, not a past tense report, present tense, happening now. Thorn drew his blade. The steel caught the dim light and held it. A thin, cold line that divided the room into before and after. Stay behind me, he said. No. He looked at her. She stood with the kitchen knife in her grip and her bare feet on the cold stone and her body angled toward the door, like someone who had decided that the next thing coming through it would have to go through her first. Elara, I cannot protect you and fight at the same time. Then do not protect me. Fight! Boots in the corridor. Fast. Multiple. The sound of men running in formation, but whose formation and toward what objective were questions that no longer had reliable answers. Thorn positioned himself between Elara and the door. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat dropped. The metabolic override of a man whose body had been trained to enter combat the way other men entered rooms, with full awareness and zero hesitation. The door exploded inward. 3 men. Not his soldiers, or they had been his soldiers once, wearing his colors, carrying his weapons, but the eyes behind the helmets were wrong. Empty. The eyes of men who had already committed to an outcome and no longer needed to think about whether it was right. Thorn moved. The first man died before he finished stepping through the doorframe. The blade entered beneath the chin and exited through the back of the skull, and Thorn was already turning, already pulling the steel free, already calculating the angle of the second attacker's approach. The second man swung a short sword at chest height. Thorn deflected it with his forearm guard, felt the impact shudder through his bones, and drove his knee into the man's ribs with enough force to fold him in half. The third man got close enough to draw blood, a shallow cut across Thorn's left shoulder that opened the fabric of his shirt and left a hot, wet line across his skin. Thorn caught the man's wrist, twisted until the joint gave way with a sound like green wood breaking, and put his blade through the man's throat. 3 bodies on the floor, blood pooling on cold stone. The fight had lasted 8 seconds. Thorn stood in the doorway with blood on his hands and his chest heaving and the cut on his shoulder seeping warmth down his arm, and he looked at the men he had just killed. Men who had worn his uniform. Men who had eaten at his tables and slept under his roof and sworn oaths that had meant nothing when the price was right. He felt something collapse inside him. Not strength, not resolve. Something older. Something foundational. Trust. The architecture of faith that a man builds between himself and the people he commands. The invisible structure that makes an army more than a collection of individuals and makes a kingdom more than a collection of buildings. It was crumbling, not slowly, not gradually. It was coming apart the way ice comes apart in spring, sudden, catastrophic, revealing black water beneath what had looked like solid ground. Alara touched his arm. Her hand was shaking, her face was white, but her eyes were steady and her voice, when she spoke, carried the terrifying clarity of a woman who had already survived worse than this and intended to survive this too. We cannot stay here. I know. The compound is compromised. Your army is compromised. Your council may be compromised. Everything you built is a house with termites in the foundation, and you have been living in it for 9 days without knowing the floor was about to give. He looked at her. Blood dripped from his fingers. The compound alarm was still sounding. That deep, rhythmic pulse that turned the walls into a heartbeat belonging to a body that was dying. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that the king who walked into Blackthorn Hall and carried me out, the man who operated on certainty and force, and the assumption that his word was enough to reshape reality, that man cannot survive what is coming. Lucien is not fighting you with soldiers. He is fighting you with your own system, your own people, your own rules. And as long as you play the game the way you have always played it, he will keep turning your pieces against you. Then what? Then stop being the man they expect. Stop being the king who follows the pattern they have already mapped. If they have bought your soldiers, stop relying on soldiers. If they have corrupted your council, stop operating through the council. If every structure you built has been infiltrated, then burn the structures and build something they cannot predict. The alarm stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was the silence of a system that had either been resolved or had failed completely, and there was no way to know which until you opened the next door. Thorn looked at the 3 dead men on his floor. He looked at the blood on his hands. He looked at the woman standing barefoot in a room full of violence with a kitchen knife and a spine made of something harder than any steel his empire had ever forged. And he understood what she was asking him to do. Not to fight harder, not to plan better, not to outmaneuver the enemy with superior tactics or greater force. She was asking him to become someone else, to abandon the identity that had defined him for 20 years, the sovereign who ruled through structure and fear and institutional dominance, and become something fluid, unpredictable, and fundamentally new. A man his enemies had never met, a king no one had mapped, a threat that could not be bought because it could not be categorized. The cost of that transformation was everything he had built. The cost of refusing it was everything he had left. He dropped his blade. The steel rang against the stone floor like a bell tolling the end of something that could never be started again. Get dressed, he said. We are leaving the compound. Where are we going? Somewhere that does not exist on any map Lucien has ever seen. He took her hand. His grip was blood-slick and shaking, not from fear, but from the specific full-body tremor of a man in the act of destroying his own foundation so he could build something on ground his enemies had never walked. They stepped over the bodies and walked into the dark corridor. Behind them, the royal compound of Vareth, the fortress that had not fallen in 1,000 years, burned with the fires of a betrayal that had been paid for in gold and executed in silence. The Alpha King was gone, and the man who would return in his place had not yet been born. They moved through the capital's underbelly like ghosts wearing the skins of the living. Thorn knew the tunnels beneath Vareth the way he knew the scars on his own hands, by feel, by memory, by the accumulated muscle knowledge of a man who had spent his first years as a young prince crawling through drainage channels and abandoned mining shafts because his father believed that a king who did not know the guts of his own city did not deserve the crown sitting on top of it. The tunnels smelled of wet stone and iron and centuries of runoff from a civilization that had never bothered to look at its own foundations. Alara followed without speaking. Her bare feet struck the damp stone in a rhythm that matched his stride despite the difference in their legs. She had pulled on boots taken from one of the dead soldiers in the corridor, too large, unlaced, slapping loosely against her ankles, but she moved in them with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent years adapting to equipment that was never designed for her. They surfaced 2 miles east of the compound in a cellar beneath an abandoned tannery. The building had been condemned 8 years ago after a fire gutted the upper stories, leaving only the stone foundations and a basement that now served as an unofficial waypoint for intelligence operatives running dark routes through the capital. Thorn locked the cellar door behind them, pushed a broken table against it, checked the 3 narrow windows near the ceiling, sealed with iron grates, no line of sight from the street. Then he sat on the floor with his back against the wall and bled. The cut on his shoulder had opened further during the descent through the tunnels. Blood had soaked through his shirt and dried in a stiff, dark patch that cracked when he moved. The pain was secondary, a background signal his nervous system had learned to deprioritize decades ago. What concerned him was the blood loss. Not enough to kill. Enough to slow him down. And slow, right now, was a kind of death that just took longer to arrive. Alara knelt beside him. She tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt, the overlarge linen she had been wearing since her first night in the compound, and pressed it against the wound. Her hands were steady, clinical. The hands of someone who had treated injuries before, not because she had been trained, but because injuries had been a regular feature of her environment and untreated wounds attracted attention from people whose attention you did not want. "Hold this." He held it. She tied the compress with a knot that was tight enough to slow the bleeding and loose enough to allow circulation. Her fingers worked fast, precise, without the gentle hesitation that most people brought to the act of touching a wound. She was not being careful with him. She was being effective. The difference mattered more than he could articulate. "How long before they know we're gone?" she asked. "They already know. Hale will have reached the quarters within minutes of the alarm. He will find the bodies. He will find us gone. The question is not when they know. The question is how many of the people looking for us are looking to help, and how many are looking to finish the job." "You trust Hale." It was not a question. It was a test. She was asking him to examine the one assumption he had not yet been willing to touch. Thorn closed his eyes. Behind the lids, he saw Roderick Hale. 18 years of service, 100 shared battlefields, the man who had pulled Thorn from the rubble of a collapsed siege tower at Ashenmoor and carried him half a mile under arrow fire because leaving him was not a concept that existed inside Hale's operational framework. "Yes," he said, "I trust Hale." Why? Because if Lucian had bought Hale, I would already be dead. He would not need to buy 3 soldiers to breach my perimeter. He would just need 1 general to open the front door. Alara considered this. Nodded once. The nod was small, but it carried weight. The acknowledgement of a logical framework she had tested and found sound. "Then Hale is your way back in." "I am not going back in." She looked at him. The cellar was lit by a single stub of candle she had found on a shelf and lit with flint from the dead soldier's kit. The light made her face angular, sharp-boned, the shadows pooling beneath her cheekbones and in the hollows of her eyes. She looked like a woman who had been carved from something harder than the wood and stone around her. You said you would burn the structures, build something they could not predict. I did. Then what does that look like? He opened his eyes, stared at the ceiling. Water stains spread across the stone in patterns that looked like maps of countries that did not exist. Lucien's strategy depends on controlling the system. He buys soldiers, corrupts councils, manipulates legal processes. Every move he makes assumes that I will respond within the institutional framework he has already infiltrated. He has mapped every corridor of my empire, every chain of command, every decision tree. He knows how I think because I have been thinking the same way for 20 years. So stop thinking that way. I am. That is what scares me. The admission landed in the silence of the cellar like a stone dropped into a well. Thorn Valerius, the man who had built 8 centuries of fear into a personal weapon, had just admitted to being afraid. Not of Lucian, not of the army at his borders or the traitors in his walls. Afraid of the version of himself he was about to become. The version that operated without the structures he had spent 2 decades building. The version that had no map, no protocol, no playbook. A man with nothing to lose is not brave. He is simply operating without the weight that makes other men hesitate. And the absence of that weight does not feel like freedom. It feels like falling. Iron Veil, he said. What? Iron Veil Citadel, 70 miles northeast. Decommissioned fortress from the border wars. No garrison, no staff, no strategic value on any current military assessment. It is not on Lucien's maps because it is not on anyone's maps. It was struck from the official registry 12 years ago after the Eastern Territories were consolidated. You want to fight a war from a ruin. I want to fight a war from a position Lucien cannot see. His intelligence network has penetrated every active military installation in Vareth. Every command post, every communications hub, every supply depot. He knows where my armies are because my armies are where they have always been. Iron Veil is nowhere, and right now, nowhere is the only place he cannot reach. Elara sat back on her heels. The candle flickered, her shadow stretched and compressed against the wall behind her like something breathing. You need Hale. I need Hale. You need to contact him without using any channel Lucian has compromised. Yes. How? Thorn reached into his coat. His fingers closed around something small and cold. He pulled it out and held it in his palm. A communication crystal. Not the military-grade models used by his intelligence network. A personal one. Old, scratched. The kind of crystal that operated on a frequency so outdated that modern intercept technology would not bother scanning for it. This was my father's, he said. Hale has the paired crystal. He has carried it for 18 years. We have never used it. It was a protocol of last resort. A frequency no one alive knows exists because the technology was decommissioned before either of us held rank. A dead channel. The only one left. He activated the crystal. The blue glow was faint, anemic, the light of a device running on reserves that had not been replenished in over a decade. Roderick. Static. The kind that sounds like distance measured in years rather than miles. Then a voice. Rough. Cracked. The voice of a man who had been awake for hours and had been expecting either this call or the news that the person making it was dead. I found the bodies. Where are you? Alive. That is all you need to know on this channel. The compound is locked down. I have isolated the compromised units. 14 additional arrests. The Erat goes deeper than the 3 we identified. How deep? Deep enough to restructure the entire Eastern Command chain. Voss is clean. Steele is clean. Most of the council appears intact, but the military ranks, Thorn, they got to captains, field-grade officers, men with access to deployment schedules and communication protocols. Thorn's jaw tightened, his teeth pressed together until the enamel creaked. Iron Veil. What about it? I need it operational within 48 hours, skeleton staff, only people you can personally verify, no official channels, no written orders, everything verbal, everything face-to-face. Silence on the crystal. The kind of silence that happens when a man is calculating whether the order he has just received is brilliant or insane and is arriving at the uncomfortable conclusion that it might be both. You are going to fight Lucien from a decommissioned fortress with a hand-picked skeleton crew and no institutional support. Yes, that is either the bravest or the stupidest thing you have ever done. It is the only thing I have not done before, which makes it the only thing Lucien has not planned for. Another pause. Shorter this time. The pause of a man who has made his decision and is simply allowing himself one last breath before committing to it. 48 hours. I will be there. The crystal went dark. Thorn looked at Alara. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen before. Not fear, not admiration, not calculation. Something rawer. The expression of a woman who was watching a man dismantle his own legend in real time and understood the cost because she had dismantled her own survival mechanisms in the same cellar, on the same night, with the same terrifying clarity. You are different, she said. Different how? Quieter. The man who broke down Blackthorn's gates was loud, not in volume, in certainty. Every move he made assumed the world would bend. You are not assuming that anymore. No. Good. Because the world does not bend for men who are loud. It bends for men who know where the fractures are. They left the cellar before dawn. The march to Ironvale took 3 days on foot through terrain that had been deliberately forgotten. Abandoned roads, dried riverbeds, forest tracks that appeared on no map because the forests themselves had been classified as non-strategic and left to grow wild for decades. Thorn and Alara moved through them like survivors of something that had not yet finished happening, sleeping in 2-hour shifts, eating rations taken from the dead soldiers' kits, speaking only when necessary. On the second night, Alara woke to find Thorn sitting against a tree with his eyes open and his hands shaking. Not from cold, not from exhaustion, from the accumulated weight of what he had lost in the past 72 hours. His compound, his command structure, his certainty. The foundational assumption that the empire he had built was solid, that the walls he had raised and the men he had trained and the systems he had designed were his. The tremor in his hands was the physical expression of a psychological collapse he was refusing to let reach his face. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She did not speak. She did not offer comfort or reassurance or any of the verbal bandages that people apply to wounds they cannot see. She just sat, present, solid, a point of contact in a darkness that had no edges. After a long time, he spoke. I built an empire on the principle that strength prevents suffering, that if I was powerful enough, brutal enough, certain enough, the people under my protection would never face the kind of cruelty that... He stopped. Swallowed. The muscles in his throat worked like machinery under strain. The kind of cruelty that was happening inside Blackthorn Hall for 6 years, while my empire ran perfectly above it. You did not know. I should have known. The system should have known. The system was designed to know, and it failed. Which means the system was not designed as well as I believed, or the system was compromised long before Lucien started buying soldiers. Either way, the failure is mine. The failure is the system's, not yours. I am the system. She turned her head and looked at him, close. Close enough that he could see the pulse in her neck, the thin blue vein that ran beneath the skin of her jaw like a river on a map too small to read. No, she said. You were the system. You are not anymore. That is the point. He looked at her. The darkness made her face a composition of shapes, the line of her nose, the curve of her cheekbone, the shadow beneath her lower lip. She was not beautiful in the way court painters would recognize. She was beautiful in the way a load-bearing wall is beautiful, functional, essential, holding up the weight of everything above it without anyone noticing until it was gone. What am I now? He asked. Something Lucien has never fought. Ironvale Citadel materialized from the fog on the morning of the third day like the skeleton of a beast that had died standing up and never fallen. The fortress was massive, not in the ornamental, self-congratulatory way of Vareth's royal compound, but in the way of structures built during an era when architecture was a form of argument and the argument was survival. Walls 40 feet high. Towers with arrow slits that faced every compass point. A central keep of black stone that rose from the surrounding structure like a clenched fist. It was also falling apart. Vines had invaded the mortar. Sections of the outer wall had collapsed into rubble. The main gate hung from a single hinge and scraped the ground when the wind pushed it. The courtyard was a field of weeds growing through cracked flagstone. Hale was already there. He stood in the courtyard with 32 soldiers, hand-picked, personally vetted, each one a veteran whose loyalty Hale had tested not through oaths or documents, but through shared combat. Men who had bled beside him, men whose prices, if they had them, were high enough that Lucien's treasury had not yet reached them. Hale looked at Thorn. His eyes tracked the blood-stained shoulder, the 3 days of stubble, the boots that were not his, the woman beside him who stood like a person accustomed to standing in places she was not supposed to be and refusing to leave. "You look terrible." "I am alive." "Those are not mutually exclusive." Hale stepped forward, his hand extended. Thorn took it. The grip held for 3 seconds longer than protocol. 3 seconds of two men confirming to each other through pressure and eye contact that the bond between them had survived the rot that had consumed everything around it. "Status," Thorn said. "Lucien moved. Yesterday. His army crossed the eastern border in 3 columns. 62,000 confirmed. They are heading for the capital." "Let them take it." Hale blinked. In 18 years, it was only the second time Thorn had genuinely surprised him. "Let them..." "Thorn! The capital is the seat of the Empire. If Lucien takes Verith, Lucien takes a city full of compromised officers and corrupted systems, and a council chamber he has already hollowed out from the inside. Let him have it. Let him sit on a throne surrounded by men he bought and discover what every conqueror eventually discovers, that the thing you captured is not the thing you wanted. The Empire is not the city. The Empire is not the compound. The Empire is not the throne." "Then what is it?" Thorn looked at Alara. She stood in the weed-choked courtyard of a ruined fortress with borrowed boots and wind-burned skin and the kitchen knife she had never let go of, and she looked back at him with eyes that held no illusion about what was coming and no desire to be anywhere else. "The Empire is the people who choose to stay when the walls come down." Hale absorbed this. His jaw worked. His arms crossed and uncrossed. Then he nodded, not the nod of a soldier following orders, but the nod of a man choosing a direction and accepting everything it would cost. "Lucien will consolidate in the capital within 4 days. He will establish his command structure. He will present himself as a stabilizing force, the reasonable alternative to a king who abandoned his throne, and then he will come looking for you. I'm counting on it. You want him to come here. I want him to come here with his army stretched thin across an occupied capital, his supply lines extended 70 miles into hostile territory, and his intelligence network suddenly blind because every agent he planted in my compound is now feeding information to a throne he already controls. He spent 2 years infiltrating my systems. Those systems are his now, which means every piece of intelligence they generate flows to him, about him, telling him what he already knows. He bought my eyes. Now they are staring at a mirror." Hale stared at him. Then a sound came out of the general's chest. Low, involuntary, something between a laugh and a growl. "You gave him the compound on purpose. I gave him a trap that looks like a victory, the most dangerous kind." The wind picked up. It moved through the ruined fortress like breath through broken teeth, whistling in the gaps between stones, rattling the hanging gate. Thorn turned to face the eastern horizon, the direction from which Lucien's army was advancing, the direction from which the next chapter of this war would arrive whether he was ready or not. He was not ready. 32 soldiers in a decomposing fortress against 62,000. No supply chain, no institutional support, no margin for error. But he had something Lucien did not. He had nothing left to protect except the things that mattered. And a man defending the things that matter fights differently than a man acquiring the things he wants. The acquirer calculates. The defender detonates. The acquirer weighs cost against benefit. The defender has already paid the cost and is simply waiting to deliver the receipt. 4 days. That was how long they had before Lucien consolidated the capital and turned his attention northeast. 4 days to fortify a ruin. 4 days to build a strategy from rubble. 4 days to turn 32 soldiers into something that could survive the collision with an empire. Thorn walked into the keep. The stone was cold. The corridors were dark. Water dripped from cracks in the ceiling and pooled on floors that had not been walked in 12 years. He found the central command room, a circular chamber at the heart of the keep with a stone table in the center and narrow windows that admitted thin blades of light. He stood at the table and looked at the bare stone surface and saw, in his mind, the maps he would draw, the plans he would build, the war he would wage from a place that existed outside every system his enemy had corrupted. Alara entered behind him. She set the kitchen knife on the stone table. The blade made a small, clear sound against the surface, the sound of something being committed. "What now?" she said. "Now we go to war." With what? With everything they think we do not have. Outside, the sky was turning the color of iron. Storm clouds massed on the eastern horizon in formations that looked like the advance columns of an army assembling beyond the edge of the visible world. And somewhere inside those clouds, moving steadily, inevitably, with the patient certainty of a man who believed he had already won, Lucien Mordrake was coming. He was bringing 62,000 soldiers. He was bringing the full weight of the Crimson Dominion. He was bringing the end of everything Thorn had built. And he did not know, could not know, had not accounted for, had not imagined in his worst strategic nightmares, that the man waiting for him in a ruined fortress was no longer the king he had studied. The king was dead. What waited at Ironvale was something worse, a man with nothing left to lose and someone worth dying for standing at his side. Lucien came on the 4th day, exactly as Hale had predicted. His army moved across the landscape like a stain spreading through fabric, slow, inevitable, consuming everything it touched without effort or apology. 62,000 soldiers in staggered columns that stretched back toward the horizon until the rearguard disappeared into the haze of distance and dust. Supply wagons, siege engines, cavalry flanks that moved in disciplined formations along the ridgelines like wolves pacing the edges of a kill zone, patient, circling, waiting for the signal to collapse inward. From the highest tower of Ironvale Citadel, Thorn watched them come. His shoulder throbbed beneath the compress Alara had tied 3 days ago. The wound had closed, but the tissue beneath was hot and stiff. A low-grade infection his body was fighting without the help of healers or medicine or any of the institutional support systems he had spent his life taking for granted. He ignored it the way he ignored everything that threatened to slow him down. By absorbing it, metabolizing it, converting pain into a fuel source his enemies could not see. Hale climbed the tower stairs and stood beside him. Forward scouts put their vanguard at 6 hours out. The main body arrives by nightfall. Siege formation. No, open assault columns. He is not planning to surround us and wait. He is planning to roll through us. Good. That is not the word I would use. He thinks we are a remnant, a deposed king hiding in a ruin with a handful of loyalists. He is coming to clean up a mess, not fight a war. That is arrogance. Arrogance leaves gaps. Gaps do not matter much when the man walking through them has 62,000 soldiers behind him. They matter when the gaps are structural. Thorn turned from the window. His eyes carried the specific, focused intensity of a man who had spent 4 days without sleep converting desperation into architecture. "Show me what we built." They descended into the keep. The central command room had been transformed. The bare stone table now held hand-drawn maps, crude, precise, sketched by Thorn himself from memory during the sleepless hours between midnight and dawn. The maps showed Ironvale and the surrounding terrain in brutal detail. The narrow valley approach from the east, the collapsed ridgeline to the north, the river gorge to the south that cut the landscape like a wound in the earth's surface. Ironvale had been decommissioned because it had no strategic value. It sat in a geographic dead zone, a depression between 2 mountain ridges with a single viable approach road and terrain so broken on all other sides that moving an army through it would take weeks. Lucian's strategists had looked at this geography and seen a dead end, a cornered animal in a hole with no escape routes. Thorn had looked at it and seen a funnel. The eastern approach narrows to 400 yards between the river gorge and the north ridge, he said, pointing. 62,000 soldiers cannot deploy across a 400-yard front. They compress. They stack. The rear columns cannot support the front. The cavalry flanks cannot execute pincer movements because the terrain will not allow lateral deployment. He has to come at us straight, narrow, and deep. Hale studied the map. His expression shifted from skepticism to concentration to something that looked uncomfortably like hope. You are turning his numbers against him. His numbers are his weakness. He brought an army designed for open field warfare into terrain that turns mass into liability. Every additional soldier he pushes into that funnel is another body that cannot maneuver, cannot retreat, and cannot do anything except press forward into whatever we have waiting. And what do we have waiting? Thorne looked at him. Everything this fortress was built to do before someone decided it was obsolete. They had spent 4 days reactivating Ironvale's original defensive systems, mechanisms designed during an era of border warfare when fortresses were not symbols of power, but machines of attrition. Thorne's 32 soldiers had cleared collapsed passages, restored drainage channels that could be flooded to create mudfields across the approach road, repositioned fallen masonry into choke points that would fracture advancing columns into isolated segments. The fortress itself became the weapon, its walls, its terrain, its geography, all converted into force multipliers that turned 32 defenders into something that fought with the effective weight of 1,000. It was not enough to win. Thorne knew that. Hale knew that. Every soldier in the fortress knew that. 32 against 62,000, no matter how favorable the terrain, no matter how brilliant the strategy, was a math problem with only one answer. But winning was not the objective. Surviving long enough was. Because on the second night at Ironvale, Thorne had sent Councilwoman Steele a message through a channel so convoluted it had taken 12 hours to arrive. The message contained 3 sentences. Steele had responded with one word. The word was coming. Dusk arrived like a held breath finally released. The sky turned the color of a bruise, deep purple at the edges, sickly yellow at the center, the kind of light that made everything look like it was already wounded. The temperature dropped. Fog crept up from the river gorge and spread across the valley floor in a thin, cold layer that erased the ground and turned the approaching army into a formation of upper bodies and banners floating above a white sea. Thorne stood on the wall above the main gate. His blade was at his hip. His hands rested on the battlements. The stone was cold and rough beneath his palms, the texture of something that had endured centuries and did not care who stood on it or why. Elara climbed the stairs and stood beside him. She had changed in the 4 days since they had arrived at Ironvale. Not visibly. She was still thin, still scarred, still wearing borrowed clothes that did not fit. The change was structural. Something in the way she held her spine. Something in the way her eyes tracked movement and assessed threats with the automatic precision of a woman who had stopped flinching and started calculating. The servant was gone. The person who remained was someone who had been compressed by years of cruelty into something denser and harder than the people who had applied the pressure, and was only now discovering the shape of what that compression had created. "He is here," she said. "Yes. 32 soldiers. 32 soldiers, 1 fortress, and you." She looked at him. "I am not a soldier." "No. You are the reason the soldiers are here." "That is not—" "It is. Every man in this fortress volunteered. Every one of them knows the numbers. Every one of them chose to stand on this wall because the alternative was serving a system that tortured a woman for 6 years and called it domestic service. You did not ask them to fight. You did not have to. Your existence asked the question, and they answered it." Her jaw tightened. The muscles in her neck stood out like cords beneath the skin. She was fighting something. Not tears, she had passed beyond tears, but the overwhelming structural pressure of being told that her life had value by people who were willing to prove it with their own. "I do not want anyone to die for me." "Then let them live for you. Same outcome. Better framing." A horn sounded from the valley, low, long. The sound rolled across the fog and bounced off the mountain ridges and returned as an echo that layered over itself until the air vibrated with a harmonic that felt less like sound and more like pressure. Lucien's army had reached the mouth of the funnel. The first assault came at full dark. Lucien sent his vanguard, 3,000 heavy infantry in tight formation, shields locked, moving up the approach road in a column that filled the 400-yard gap between the gorge and the ridge, like a river of steel and flesh. They expected a ruin defended by a handful of desperate men. They expected to breach the gate within the hour. They hit the mud field at 200 yards. The flooded drainage channels had turned the approach road into a marsh that swallowed boots to the ankle and broke formations into staggering clusters of men fighting the ground as much as any enemy. The lock shield wall fractured, gaps opened, soldiers stumbled into each other, tripped over submerged stones, cursed in the specific vocabulary of men whose training had not included wading through knee-deep muck in full armor in the dark. Thorn's archers fired from the walls. 32 soldiers, but the narrow front meant that every arrow found a target in the compressed mass below. The vanguard took casualties it could not absorb because the men behind kept pushing forward into men who had stopped. And the men who had stopped could not retreat because the men behind them filled every inch of available space. The first wave broke in 40 minutes. They pulled back, regrouped. Lucien sent the second wave with torches and wooden planking to bridge the mudfield. Thorn's soldiers ignited the drainage oil, a reserve of lamp fuel they had found in the fortress cellars, and poured into the flooded channels. The approach road became a corridor of fire that turned the fog orange and filled the valley with the sound of men screaming and the smell of things burning that should not burn. The second wave broke in 20 minutes. Lucien did not send a third wave. Instead, he came himself. A single rider emerged from the fog at dawn. The horse was white, a deliberate choice, a visual statement, the kind of theatrical precision that Lucien applied to everything from diplomacy to warfare. He rode to the edge of the mudfield, still smoking from the night's fires, and stopped. "Thorn," the voice carried, not loud, projected. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that his words reached exactly the people he intended and no further. Thorn stood on the wall. Dawn light caught the left side of his face and left the right in shadow. He was covered in soot. His shoulder wound had reopened during the night and dried blood crusted the compress beneath his shirt. His eyes were red-rimmed from smoke and sleeplessness. He looked like a man who had been through something that should have killed him and had emerged on the other side, not intact but still upright, which was its own kind of victory. "Lucien, but you killed 800 of my soldiers last night. I know." With 32 men, terrain is a multiplier. Terrain is a delay. You know this. You cannot hold this position. I will bring engineers. I will drain your channels. I will bridge your mud. I will dismantle this fortress stone by stone if necessary. The math has not changed. You have 32. I have 61,000. Then why are you talking to me instead of dismantling? Silence. The fog moved between them like a living thing, slow and cold, threading through the space between the wall and the rider like a mediator that had already failed. "Because I want you to understand something," Lucien said. "I do not want to destroy you. I want the girl. Give her to me and this ends. You walk away. You rebuild. You remain king of Vareth with my recognition and my alliance. Everything you have lost in the past 2 weeks, your compound, your command structure, your authority, I will return it, all of it, in exchange for one person. One person who happens to carry the most strategically valuable genetic marker on the continent. One person whose value is precisely why she should be in the custody of someone who can protect her properly. You are standing on a wall with 32 soldiers and a flesh wound. You cannot protect her. You can only delay the inevitable. The inevitable is not your word to define. It is when I have 61,000 soldiers defining it for me." Thorn leaned forward. His hands gripped the battlements. The stone cut into his palms. "Let me tell you what I learned in the past 2 weeks, Lucien. I learned that the empire I built was hollow. I learned that the systems I trusted were for sale. I learned that the men I commanded could be purchased for less than the cost of a good horse. I learned that everything I thought was solid was actually a structure built on the assumption that no one would bother to test it. You tested it, and it broke. Congratulations." He straightened. "But here's what you did not learn. You did not learn that the thing you are trying to take is not a thing. She is not a weapon. She is not a bloodline. She is not a strategic asset to be acquired and deployed. She is a woman who asked me for help, and I came. And the reason you will lose this war is not because I am stronger than you or smarter than you or better prepared. It is because you are trying to take something, and I am trying to keep someone. And the man who fights for someone will break every rule, burn every structure, and destroy every system, including his own, to stay standing. You cannot buy that. You cannot strategize around it. You cannot bring enough soldiers to outweigh it. Lucien sat on his white horse and regarded the man on the wall. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation that arrived at a number he did not like. You will die on that wall. Maybe, but you will remember why. Lucien turned his horse. The white flank caught the dawn light and glowed like a signal fire retreating into the fog. He would bring the engineers. He would drain the channels. He would commit the full weight of his army, and Thorn would hold. Not because holding was possible, because holding was necessary, because the difference between possible and necessary was the distance between a strategist and a king, and Thorn had stopped being a strategist the night he carried a woman out of Blackthorn Hall. The final assault came at noon. Lucien sent everything. Engineers cleared the mud field under arrow fire, losing men in numbers that would have been unacceptable in any rational calculation, but were absorbed by the sheer mass of soldiers available to replace them. Wooden bridges spanned the drainage channels. Heavy infantry advanced in formation so dense the individual soldiers disappeared into a single, grinding wall of metal and flesh that filled the funnel from edge to edge. Thorn fought from the wall. His blade moved in the mechanical, repetitive rhythm of a man who had passed beyond technique into something more fundamental. The animal imperative to keep the body alive and the people behind it breathing. His soldiers fought beside him. 32 men and women who held a wall they could not hold because the man beside them was holding it, and stopping meant letting him stand alone. Alara was in the keep, not hiding, coordinating. She had spent 4 days learning the fortress layout with the obsessive precision of a woman whose survival had always depended on knowing every exit and every obstacle between her and the nearest door. She directed the reserve runners, soldiers cycling between the wall and the supply caches, carrying arrows, water, bandages. She managed the flow of resources with the efficiency of someone who had spent years managing a kitchen under threat of violence and understood that logistics was not a military discipline, but a survival one. The wall held for 3 hours. Then it broke. A section of the eastern battlement collapsed under the combined weight of siege ladders and the soldiers climbing them. The breach was 20 feet wide. Enemy soldiers poured through it like water through a crack in a dam. Not in formation, not in order, but in the desperate, scrambling chaos of men who had been compressed for hours and suddenly found space to fill. Thorn dropped from the wall into the courtyard. His boots hit the flagstone, and the impact shot through his knees and into his spine. He did not pause. He moved toward the breach with his blade raised and his lungs burning, and the specific crystalline clarity that descends on a man who has accepted that the next few minutes will determine whether everything he has fought for survives or disappears. He killed the first soldier through the breach, and the second, and the third. Each strike was a sentence in a conversation he was having with the idea of defeat, a conversation in which his only argument was his refusal to stop moving. Hale appeared beside him. The general was bleeding from a cut above his ear. His armor was dented. His eyes were wild with the controlled madness of a professional soldier who has been pushed past the limits of his training and is now operating on something older and less rational. "We cannot hold the breach." "We hold it." "Thorn, they're pouring." A horn sounded. Not from the valley, not from Lucien's army, from the west. Both men turned. Through the fog and smoke and the dust of collapsing masonry, something was moving along the western ridge, a formation of soldiers descending the mountain slope in a column that stretched back beyond the fog line. Their banners were blue and silver, the colors of Vareth's reserve legions. The legions that had been stationed in the western provinces under commanders who answered not to the king, not to the council, but to Councilwoman Margaret Steele, who had spent 20 years building a parallel command structure inside the intelligence directorate that operated on a single principle. When the main system fails, the backup activates. Steele's message had been one word: Coming. She had meant it. The western column hit Lucien's army in the flank, 12,000 fresh soldiers striking the extended, compressed, overcommitted mass of an invasion force that had been funneled into a 400-yard corridor and could not turn to face a lateral threat without collapsing its own formation. The effect was catastrophic. Lucien's rear columns, unable to advance or retreat through the clogged approach road, broke first. The panic traveled forward through the army like a shockwave, each rank absorbing the chaos of the rank behind it and amplifying it before passing it on. Within an hour, the disciplined invasion force had fragmented into isolated clusters of soldiers fighting on three fronts: the wall ahead, the western flank, and their own disintegrating formation behind. Thorn fought through the breach and into the valley. He was looking for one man. He found him at the center of the collapsing formation, still mounted on the white horse, still composed, still radiating the cold precision of a ruler who had not yet accepted that the equation had changed. Lucien saw him coming. Their eyes met across 50 yards of churned mud and broken bodies and smoke that turned the battlefield into something that looked less like a place and more like a condition, the physical manifestation of what happens when two wills collide and neither yields. Thorn reached him. Lucien dismounted. He drew his blade, a thin, elegant weapon, ornamental in appearance, lethal in practice. He moved with the economy of a man who had trained with masters and killed with efficiency, and had never once doubted that skill and preparation would carry him through any encounter. They fought, not the choreographed symmetrical combat of tournament duels, the ugly, gasping, off-balance violence of two men who were too exhausted and too committed and too far past the boundaries of rational behavior to do anything except swing and block and swing again. Thorn's shoulder screamed, his vision blurred at the edges. His lungs pulled air that tasted of smoke and copper. Lucien was faster, lighter, less damaged, less burdened by the accumulated physical cost of 3 days of siege warfare. He opened a cut across Thorn's ribs, drew blood from his forearm, pressed him backward through the mud with strikes that were precise and clinical and completely devoid of the desperate, irrational energy that was the only thing keeping Thorn on his feet. That energy. That was the difference. Lucien fought with skill. Thorn fought with something that skill could not match. The absolute, total, molecular-level commitment of a man who had lost everything except the one thing he refused to lose, and was channeling every ounce of remaining life force into the space between his blade and the man who threatened it. He parried Lucien's thrust, stepped inside the reach, drove his forehead into Lucien's face. The impact was brutal, graceless. The kind of move that no instructor teaches because it sacrifices positioning for damage and is only useful when damage is the only currency you have left to spend. Lucien staggered. Blood erupted from his nose. His guard dropped for half a second. Thorn's blade found his wrist. The thin sword fell into the mud. Thorn kicked Lucien's knee. The Emperor dropped. Hit the ground with a sound that was less an impact and more a punctuation. The period at the end of a sentence that had been writing itself for weeks. Thorn stood over him, blade at his throat, both men breathing in the ragged, desperate rhythm of bodies that had been pushed past their operational limits and were running on the fumes of will alone. "Yield," Thorn said. Lucien looked up at him. Blood ran from his nose into his mouth. His pale eyes held the specific, dangerous clarity of a man who was calculating whether death was preferable to surrender and had not yet finished the math. If I yield, you win. If you kill me, you win. Either way, you understand that this changes nothing. Someone else will come for her. The blood she carries is too valuable. The world will not stop wanting what she has. The world can want. It cannot take. You cannot protect her forever. I do not need to protect her forever. I need to protect her now. Forever is just a series of no's that a man refuses to quit. Lucien closed his eyes, opened them. The math was done. I yield. Thorn lowered his blade. The battlefield settled around them. The sounds of combat faded, not suddenly, but gradually, the way a storm fades, each clash and shout diminishing by degrees until the dominant sound was wind and the groaning of wounded men and the heavy, exhausted breathing of survivors who had not yet processed the fact that they were still alive. Steele's forces completed the encirclement. Lucien's remaining officers surrendered in groups. First the field commanders, then the unit leaders, then the rank and file, weapons dropping into the mud with a collective clatter that sounded like the skeleton of an army being disassembled bone by bone. Thorn walked back to the fortress. His legs carried him through the breach in the wall, across the courtyard, up the stairs of the keep. Each step cost something. His body was a ledger of damage. The shoulder wound, the cut across his ribs, the gash on his forearm, the deep bruising across his knees and spine, and beneath all of it, the bone-level exhaustion of a man who had not slept in 4 days and had spent the last 3 hours in close combat. He found Alara in the command room. She was standing at the stone table where the kitchen knife still lay. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was pale and streaked with soot from the fires that had drifted smoke through the keep's ventilation channels. She was shaking, the full-body tremor of accumulated adrenaline with nowhere left to go. She saw him. She saw the blood. She saw the way he moved. Slower, heavier, the gait of a man held upright by stubbornness rather than strength. She crossed the room. She did not run. She walked, deliberately, each step a decision, each step a choice to close the distance between herself and a man who had dismantled his own empire, abandoned his own throne, and fought a war from a ruin to keep a promise he had made in a corridor where she had been polishing a floor that did not need polishing. She reached him. Her hands came up and pressed flat against his chest, not an embrace, not a gesture of affection, but a verification. The tactile confirmation that the body in front of her was solid, present, still generating heat, still pulling air in and pushing it out. His hands covered hers. They stood in the command room of a shattered fortress with the sounds of a surrendering army drifting through the narrow windows and the afternoon light falling across the stone floor in long, tired slants, and they breathed. "You held," she said. "We held. You are bleeding. I have been bleeding for 2 weeks. It is a condition at this point." She almost laughed. The sound caught in her throat and came out as something between a breath and a syllable. Not quite laughter, not quite a sob, but the noise a body makes when it tries to express relief and discovers that relief does not have a sound, only a feeling, and the feeling is too large for any single noise to contain. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we rebuild." "From what?" He looked around the room, the crude maps on the stone table, the cracked walls, the water stains on the ceiling, the kitchen knife lying on the stone like a monument to every improvised weapon wielded by every person who had ever fought with less than they needed and more than anyone expected. From this. The weeks that followed moved at a different speed. Lucien was returned to the Crimson Dominion under guard, not as a prisoner of war, but as a sovereign whose military adventure had failed and whose continued rule was contingent on a treaty so restrictive that his empire would spend a generation recovering from the cost of his ambition. Steele negotiated the terms. Thorn signed them. The process was institutional, proper, documented, witnessed, but the institution that administered it was not the one that had existed before. It was something rebuilt from components Thorn had selected personally, stripped of the corrupted channels and compromised officers and hollow protocols that Lucien had exploited. The capital was restored. Not to its former state. Thorn refused that. The former state had been a facade, a system that functioned perfectly on the surface while concealing rot that reached to the foundation. What he built instead was leaner, more transparent, harder to infiltrate because it was harder to hide inside. Every chain of command was shortened. Every oversight process was restructured around accountability rather than hierarchy. The empire that emerged was not the empire that had been. It was smaller in some ways and stronger in others, the way a bone is stronger after it breaks and heals. Blackthorn Hall was seized. The estate was converted into a rehabilitation facility for former contracted servants. The 14 men and women whose injuries had been documented during the inspection, and the dozens more who emerged from similar houses across the Dominion once the investigation expanded. Lord Cassian Blackthorn was tried, convicted, and stripped of his titles. Duchess Seraphine disappeared into the kind of obscurity that wealth can buy when the alternative is imprisonment. Spring came. Thorne stood in the rebuilt war room of the royal compound. Not the same room, not the same table, but the same view through the same window of a capital that was learning to trust the walls it lived inside again. He was alone. The morning light was soft and the city below was waking up, and there was a quality to the silence that he had not experienced in years. Not the silence of control, not the silence of fear. The silence of a man standing in a room he had earned through a process more honest and more costly than any conquest. Alara entered. She was dressed in clothes that fit, simple, well made, the kind of garments that announced nothing except the presence of the person wearing them. Her hair was pulled back. Her forearms were bare, the scars visible, uncovered, neither hidden nor displayed. They were facts. They were history. They were the topography of a life that had been lived under conditions that should have destroyed her and had instead produced someone who could stand in a king's war room and belong there not through blood or title or the approval of men in expensive robes, but through the sheer, undeniable evidence of what she had survived and who she had become in the surviving. "The council convenes in an hour," she said. "Steele wants to formalize the Reconstruction Charter." "I know." "She also wants to discuss the sovereign blood protocols." Thorne turned from the window. "What protocols?" "The ones she wants to establish to ensure that no carrier is ever treated as property again. Legal protections, institutional safeguards, a framework that recognizes the genetic marker as a personal attribute rather than a strategic asset." "That was your idea." "That was my requirement." He looked at her. The morning light caught the edge of her jaw, the line of her neck, the steady, unblinking directness of eyes that had learned to meet power without flinching, because flinching was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and directness was the only currency she had ever truly owned. "You are going to be very difficult to govern with," he said. "Good. You have spent 20 years surrounded by people who made it easy. Look where that got you." He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, close enough that the space between them was less a distance and more a membrane, thin, permeable, charged with the accumulated weight of everything they had survived together and everything they were about to build. "The historians will write about this," he said. "Let them. They will get it wrong. They always do. They will write about armies and strategies and political maneuvering. They will write about sovereign blood as if it were the reason for the war. They will write about the battle at Iron Vale as if the outcome were determined by troop numbers and terrain. And what will they miss? They will miss the corridor, the East Corridor in Blackthorn Hall, at 11 o'clock at night, with a stolen crystal and a woman who had no reason to believe anyone would come. They will miss the 17 minutes. They will miss the fact that the entire war, every soldier, every strategy, every treaty and reconstruction and institutional reform, began with 5 words spoken into the dark by someone who had been told her whole life that she was nothing. Thorne reached for her hand, the same gesture he had made in that corridor months ago, in a different life. His palm was rougher now. New calluses from the siege, new scars from the battle, the accumulated texture of a man who had rebuilt himself from the foundation up and carried the evidence in his skin. She took his hand, the same way she had taken it then, without hesitation, without the performance of deliberation. The simple, direct act of a woman choosing to hold on to something she had decided was worth holding. "Can you come get me?" she said quietly. He looked at her, and something in his face, the hard, gray, iron-forged certainty that the world had learned to fear, softened. Not weakened, not diminished, softened the way steel softens when it reaches the exact temperature required to be reshaped into something new. A transformation that requires heat and pressure and the willingness to pass through a state of vulnerability so complete that the material could be destroyed as easily as reforged. "Always," he said. The word filled the room the way morning light fills a space. Gradually, completely, without force. Outside, the capital stirred. Markets opened. Children ran through streets that had been emptied by war and were now filling again with the ordinary, extraordinary noise of people living their lives inside walls they had chosen to trust. The empire that had been built on fear was being rebuilt on something harder to define and harder to destroy. Not loyalty, not love, not any single word, but the compound substance created when a man who could burn the world chooses to hold one hand instead, and the woman whose hand he holds chooses to let him. Years later, when the historians wrote their accounts, they called it the Age of the Twin Crowns. They described the political reforms, the military restructuring, the treaties that remade the Continental Order. They analyzed the Battle of Iron Veil from every tactical angle and debated the strategic implications of Steele's flanking maneuver, and argued about whether Thorne's decision to abandon the capital was brilliant or reckless. They missed the corridor. They always miss the corridor. Because the thing that changes the world is never the army, or the strategy, or the throne. It is the moment when someone who has been told they are nothing speaks into the dark and discovers that someone is listening. A complete kingdom, a complete love, an eternal throne. Not because it was destined, because it was chosen.